Welcome to History Twists. In this episode, we will explore a divergence in history in which Puerto Rico becomes the 51st state, which would be an upgrade from its current status as a commonwealth. Now, we'll follow our usual pattern, which is to give a very brief history of the current timeline, the real timeline, and then spend more time talking about the outcome that would follow in that alternative timeline. Now, also, we will set up some things, we'll point out some things in the current timeline that would have led to, or could have led to, our divergence in history. I hope you enjoy this. This really, I think, is going to be an interesting one.
I agree with you, Dr. Beaver. It's intriguing to me as a historian that in the current timeline, Puerto Rico is the only one of three territories that became United States territories after the Spanish-American War in 1898. Puerto Rico is the only one that remained a U.S. territory, with Cuba in 1907 and the Philippines in 1946 after World War II taking their independence. Several referendums have been held on the issue of Puerto Rico becoming the 51st state. It's intriguing that the two most recent referendums in 2020 and just a few weeks ago during the election in 2024 have seen an increasing support for statehood. The most recent referendum eliminated the option of retaining the status quo. Approximately 59% of the voters agreed with statehood. Now, both houses of Congress would have to approve a statehood bill. In 2020, the House of Representatives passed the bill for Puerto Rican statehood, but the Senate rejected it. There would need to be some economic development because Puerto Rico has neglected to develop its mineral industry in favor of tourism, so it has an underdeveloped economy.
Yeah, Dr. Deneen, as you mentioned, Puerto Rico has many natural resources, more than we tend to know about or talk about. These include abandoned farmlands, oil, yes, oil, offshore oil, but oil nonetheless, and minerals, especially gold. In the current timeline, Puerto Rico imports 80% of the food they eat, while experts say that they have the capacity to produce between 75 and 80% of the foodstuffs they need. In addition, the gold has not been mined, and while extracting the oil, a lot of which, as I said, is offshore, at this point in time, with our current technology, it would not be cost effective. But no real effort has been directed towards inventing technology to extract their oil. And one of the other things is, when I said abandoned farmlands, now Puerto Rico, at one point in time, exported a lot of fruits and other things. But, as you pointed out, Dr. Deneen, they kind of followed what many of the Caribbean islands did, which was to say that their major source of income was going to be tourism. Well, thanks to some very negative stereotyping, not that many people go to Puerto Rico for their vacations and whatnot. And it has become a problem because the tourism income has not been sufficient to offset their lack of exports.
I would like to hope that would change because it's a beautiful area from what I understand. Now, it's important to realize in our timeline, the political autonomy of Puerto Rico develops gradually. In 1917, the Congress extended United States citizenship to Puerto Rican peoples for consular and travel purposes abroad.
Now, could you explain to people what that means? I mean, I know what it means, travel and consular purposes, but could you explain what that means?
Well, what that means, if you're traveling outside the United States
Uh
and
huh.
you need services from an embassy, or you get into trouble or lose a passport, or sometimes just need assistance in obtaining research materials, I've done that in the past, you can ask an embassy or a consulate for assistance. And if you don't have citizenship, it's almost impossible to do that.
So this right has been extended to Puerto Ricans who are overseas. They can go to a United States embassy.
Yes,
Or okay, okay. Go
that
ahead. I'm
was
sorry to
that
interrupt.
was a reward for military service in the First World War. 25,000 men from the island served in American forces in the First World War, and 85,000 in the Second, which led to greater autonomy. By 1952, Puerto Ricans had their own constitution, a fully elected legislature, and an elected governor.
And it's real interesting. In the late 1950s, the civil rights movements in the United States sparked a wider attention to Puerto Rican political status. Now, it is not unequivocally established, but it is likely and suspected that the non voting delegate of Puerto Rico to the U.S. Congress, known as the resident commissioner, talked with numerous civil rights leaders promoting civil rights for minorities, including, of course, Puerto Ricans, and establishing a common bond. Now, let's turn to a new divergent history with a brief lead up to the events that would have led, and this is a speculation, but those events that we're going to talk about, if they had happened that way, would have led to Puerto Rico becoming the 51st state. To be clear, the rest of this is speculative, so enjoy.
Beginning in 1956, in this other scenario, the non voting delegate of Puerto Rico to the Congress, as Dr. Weaver said, who was known as the resident commissioner, begins contacting civil rights leaders
Openly.
very openly. Three of many to mention are Roy Wilkins, the head of the NAACP, Congressman William Dawson, the most prominent African American congressman at the time, and Governor William Hastie of the Virgin Islands. These three leaders attract support for Puerto Rican independence from important leaders in both parties. Republican Congressman and double amputee Charles Potter declares on the floor of the Congress in this scenario that God had saved him in World War II to help advance the cause of Puerto Rican statehood. For examples in the real world of other possible American states, see our two Things You Don't Know podcasts on states that could have been. Then Senator, future President John F. Kennedy, recognizing the island's strategic importance and the democratic principle involved in its citizens' just demands for representation, makes statehood a key part of his new frontier agenda. President Kennedy understood the need to win over Southern Dixiecrats and other conservatives who were opposed to a state led by Hispanics. Opposition to proposals for Haitian and Dominican Republic statehood had been defeated on racial lines after the Civil War. Look at our Robert Smalls podcast to learn more about that. President Kennedy assigned the task of winning over the doubters and the dissidents to his running mate, former Senate Majority Leader and now Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson. LBJ had spent a lifetime making deals. He knew every secret that opposing political leaders had, and he understood that incentives could bring others on board. Lyndon decides in this scenario He must split hardcore opponents of Puerto Rican statehood, like Virginia Senator Harry Byrd, from more moderate Dixiecrats like future Watergate hero Senator Sam Ervin from North Carolina. In this scenario, the government builds three new research hospitals in Charlotte in exchange for Senator Ervin's active support.
Another interesting aspect of this is LBJ and most everyone else knew that Puerto Rico was pretty much a Democrat leaning territory. And they could assume that they would probably side with the Democratic Party. So, another little incentive for them to go after it. So, in this divergent timeline, a constitutional referendum is held in Puerto Rico in 1961, with 61% voting for statehood. Not really an unlikely thing. The U.S. Congress passes the Puerto Rico Admission Act in 1963 in this timeline, supported by growing civil rights advocacy and Cold War strategy. Puerto Rico officially becomes a state on July the 4th, 1964, celebrated with a redesigned American flag. Major federal funding flows into Puerto Rico, improving infrastructure and education. Puerto Rico gains 2 senators and 6 representatives in Congress. No, it wouldn't be without some tensions because Puerto Rican culture infuses mainland America through food, music, and arts, but still the underlying tensions were there. There's a stereotype of most everything that we have in this country or around the world. And one of the stereotypes of Puerto Ricans is that they are criminals, that they just come here to form gangs and to take advantage of other people, etc. And gee, stereotypes are called stereotypes for a reason. And what it means is that, yeah, there are some gang members that are Puerto Rican, just like in West Side Story, the musical. Uh, there are also a lot of them that are not. Again, just like in West Side Story, it shows that, but doesn't harp on it. So the um, Democratic leaning votes affect presidential elections in the United States. And then, inspired by Puerto Rico's example, territories like Guam and American Samoa press for greater autonomy or statehood. I should say, and or statehood. The U.S. grows its Caribbean influence, making it a more formidable power during the Cold War. Puerto Rico becomes a tourism powerhouse, branding itself as America's Caribbean paradise. Wow. Mainland businesses relocate to Puerto Rico, and even in the real timeline, some of that has happened, but not as much as it would have in this divergent timeline. What this does is it brings economic growth, but also challenges like gentrification and environmental concerns become more prevalent. I mean, they don't want to destroy the beauty of their island. They don't want to do any of those things that would damage things. So they actually form a commission in Puerto Rico to maintain the cultural and ecologic beauties of Puerto Rico. And that has a dramatic influence when they have these businesses relocate to Puerto Rico, they're required to make their buildings and other things ecologically friendly. They're not allowed to destroy land. They are not allowed to pollute. They are not allowed a lot of things. And that has a great impact and influences things in the mainland of the United States, as well as in South America, which has a very significant impact on such issues as the rainforest and other places. Also, they by their example, by elevating their standard of living and by really foraging ahead and becoming a little gem, a star, a real place where people want to go, influences other South American countries to adopt some of these same principles, leading to a real change. And some of that change falls on the United States. That the Organization of American States, which has not always in the current timeline been that friendly to the United States, we become a star. The United States does. Look at what good things they brought to Puerto Rico. Look at what happens. So Puerto Rico as a state sparks similar movements worldwide for the full integration uh, of territories in countries like the UK, like for example Scotland, and it brings about a recognition that people considered minorities cannot be judged simply by the stereotypes that have become predominant.
Absolutely. These debates about assimilation versus cultural autonomy will continue to shape Puerto Rican and larger United States policies. But as you say, the reduction in poverty, greater educational attainment, and improvement in healthcare makes many lives better. Puerto Rican music, art, and literature become central to the American cultural landscape. Puerto Rican statehood sends a powerful message to the neighboring countries in South America and the Caribbean. The United States demonstrates it has outgrown its economic dollar diplomacy and it values its territories and their people, potentially fostering goodwill in a region, as you said, Dr. Weaver, that is often viewed American policies with skepticism. I think also the fact of having a U.S. state in which the primary language is not English would lead to greater cultural autonomy. I know it hasn't happened as much, but when Louisiana came into the Union way back in the 19th century, its French culture and differing attitudes scared some of the Anglo-Saxon people at that time. So I think it's good for a country to have as much diversity as possible.
Puerto Rico's enhanced status encourages economic partnerships with neighboring countries. It becomes a gateway for increased U.S. South American trade, boosting regional economies and solidifying the U.S.'s role as a leader, a humane leader, a more humane leader. As Dr. Deneen said, abandoning just the dollar, just the economic part, but valuing the other contributions, the cultural, and yes, intellectual and other aspects of a different culture. With Puerto Rico marketed as America's Caribbean state, or, you know, whatever other names would probably have come about, and the island draws tourists from both the U.S. mainland, Latin America, and Europe. So suddenly you have this influx of people from all around the world coming to Puerto Rico for vacations, for other things. And cultural festivals blend these traditions, fostering deeper connections between the United States and its southern neighbors. Now, what happens to the culture in Puerto Rico is they fiercely defend and want to have their culture not get subsumed or lost. And they make legislation to that effect. And that's important for any number of reasons. But, of course, there may have been some problems.
We don't want to pretend that even this new timeline is a utopia, so not all is positive. Some countries, especially Cuba during the Castro era, view Puerto Rico's statehood as furthering U.S. imperialism in the Caribbean. This prompts Cold War era propaganda by the Eastern Bloc, emphasizing Puerto Rico's loss of independence, fueling tensions with socialist and other anti American movements in the region. Puerto Rico's statehood acts as a catalyst for advancing civil rights and broadening minority representation all across the United States. Puerto Rico's senators and representatives advocate repeatedly for broader minority rights, aligning with civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., with the movement for better farm conditions promoted by Cesar Chavez. This strengthens congressional coalitions pushing for landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the following year, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Puerto Rico's statehood underscores the importance of all groups having representation, but particularly minorities. The visibility of Puerto Rican politicians in Washington repeatedly galvanized minority groups of all kinds nationwide, inspiring campaigns for inclusion and justice. Check out our Things You Don't Know podcast about the Disabilities Act and the Rehab Act to look at a major but lesser known part of the struggle for inclusion.
Yeah, Puerto Rico's integration shifts perceptions of Latinos in America. Now, racism, xenophobia, yeah, that would still persist for some time. But the inclusion of a Latino majority state amplifies Latino voices and elevates their issues to national prominence, thus accelerating the civil rights movement in the United States and perhaps across the world too. The other thing is that the propaganda from Cuba is not answered by the United States, the mainland in the United States, but it's answered by Puerto Rico, making it a very different scenario. And while that is occurring, there becomes a shift in Cuba. The Cubans know, they see that these people on a Caribbean island just like them are living a better life. They have more things. They have health care. Now, Cuba does have a very good health care, but they have food. They have nice places to live. They're doing well. And that continues to push for a shift. And eventually, that shift will lead to the internal overthrow of Castro and communism in Cuba, which would irritate the fire out of Russia, but leave the United States in a far, better position. Imagine how devastating it would be to Russia. They prized the fact that they had a foothold on our doorstep. If that doorstep little stop didn't exist, wow, I think there would have been more incentive for cooperation rather than aggravation and all the other Cold War stuff that went on. In addition to all of this, Puerto Rican history and culture become more widely taught in schools, whilst fostering a greater appreciation for diversity. This inclusion leads to an increase in similar efforts for African American, Native American, and Asian American histories. Imagine how profound a change that would bring because, yeah, the adults might not have adopted it as quickly, but the children that were growing up, they learned about it in school already. So, guess what? It'd be easier for them to accept and understand. Plus, with Puerto Rico having a more status, being a state, they would have had to have been acknowledged as equals. And therefore, they would have been included more. They wouldn't have been sequestered in ghettos in the big cities. And this would have led towards a lot more inclusion and acceptance by the white majority in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that this Puerto Rico statehood erases systemic racism. It doesn't. Instead, it becomes a flashpoint for debates about immigration, cultural assimilation, and equity, especially as Latino populations grow across the mainland. Now, another thing that happens too is in the current timeline, we see Latinos being hired on farms in certain regions of the United States to pick and cultivate a lot of the farm industry at very cheap rates. That would be bye bye, wouldn't happen. So that would have changed one of the economic slants in the United States, which would have meant that there would have been less consolidation of wealth in the 1% as we have now. And that would have made considerable difference because when you don't have that kind of majority sway, you can't control how other people do. And it would have put a cap on some of the corporate domination of not just finances, but in terms of acceptance and inclusion. Really interesting. Yeah, it would have caused strife. There would have been disturbed people, but would that change have been for the better in terms of democracy? Yes. Would it have come with great strife and perhaps real conflict? Absolutely. Change is not easy for anyone, and that would have represented a change.
Well, I think there would have been a ripple effect inspired by Puerto Rico's success. Other U.S. territories like Guam and American Samoa demand in this timeline greater inclusion. While some Americans view this positively, as you said, Dr. Weaver, others resist, fearing a shift in national identity. But over time, Puerto Rico's statehood continues to contribute to the broader recognition of the rights of all underrepresented people and all minorities, including women, LGBTQ plus individuals, and all sorts of indigenous groups. The success of Puerto Rican statehood sets a lasting precedent for greater inclusivity, shaping policies that support bilingual education, immigrant rights, and cultural preservation across the United States.
Well, we could go on for quite a while, but we just really wanted to explore this briefly. And to our listeners, I would say, what do you think? I'd love to hear from you because, yeah, it's a little controversial. And guess what? We have even more controversial things coming under history twists. Big time. I mean, big time controversial. And I'm excited about that because,
I am too.
yeah, because education is not just reading a book, going to a class, or any of that kind of thing. Education happens all the time, whether it's, you know, watching TV. Yeah, it's a kind of education, oftentimes not a very good one, but it's there. Or, any number of a myriad of things. And when we include more people and we have more divergence in the culture, we actually become stronger. We avoid some conflicts with people. And one of the things that communism always beat democracy in the head with was that we're not fair to minorities, and we don't do this and that for people. Well, despite the fact that they didn't either. Yeah, we made mistakes and we would continue to make mistakes. But taking this kind of a giant leap would have made a dramatic difference in many different things. So, as I say, we could go on and on and on, but in the interest of actually getting people to listen to the end, uh, we're going to stop here and we're going to welcome your comments. And as I say, we have good things coming your way.
I won't spoil the surprise, but there are excellent things coming in both history twists and things you don't know. So take the time to give us a like, comment. If you disagree with us, we have no trouble with that. Go right ahead and express your opinion as long as we do it in an atmosphere of mutual respect that we welcome diverse views and we really enjoy this process.
Absolutely. Hey, y'all come on back now. We got good stuff coming your way. All right. So for now, bye.
So long, folks.